Greetings and salutations, friends. I am Nimithrander, and today we're going to be getting into something of a contentious subject. Namely, is there power creep in Genshin Impact? And the short answer to that is yes, and the long answer to that is no, there isn't. Now, let's begin by asking what exactly is power creep? Simple definition of this would be, you have a character, or a weapon, who becomes obsolete, who becomes useless, simply because there's another character or weapon that has higher numbers, does more damage, heals faster, so on and so forth. Now, when talking Genshin Impact, there are a few important things to remember that complicate this question. Not least being elemental reactions and elemental stonewalling. So, right off the bat, we talk DPSs, because this is the simplest category to criticize. Now, each of these four here is considered a main DPS unit, as in, they are going to be your on-field attackers the majority of the time. Now, each of these is of a different element, as you can see. Now, it's important to remember that in Genshin Impact, there are enemies that are simply immune to any given element. Now, to demonstrate this
Water
right
comes
quick,
in many flavors.
we're going to engage the Hydro Tulpa. Now, many of you already know exactly how ridiculous an idea this is with New Bullet. See? Literally tells you, immune. I cannot hurt this thing at all with New Bullet or Farina.
Shower me with praise!
However, Wika can actually hurt this thing. Okay. We've made my point, so we're just gonna leave. The important thing here is the fact that Nuvolette is hard countered by the Hydro Tulpa. Nuvolette, because he is a catalyst user and a Hydro Catalyst specifically, is incapable of killing the Hydro Tulpa. He simply can't do it unless perhaps he uses a very specific catalyst. Technically, the Drinking Horn could help. Or Eye of Perception, because that deals damage that isn't purely Hydro. But, as a rule, Nuvolette cannot kill Hydro-immune enemies. And the exact same thing is true for all DPSs, for their given element. Moika cannot kill anything immune to Pyro, or, well, in her case she can hurt them, with her melees being physical, but her primary damage is still Pyro, and Pyro can simply be, well, made invincible against depending on the enemy. Same thing with Electro and Dendro, and all the other elements in the game. So, this is the first aspect you have to consider when you ask whether or not there's power creep. Namely, Nuvolette, and every other character in the game, no matter how good they are, has an enemy that they will never be able to kill on their own. Simply put, there are elemental barriers that will stonewall lots and lots of characters. And typically, even with Moika and other physical DPSs, well, generally they get a hard time for the simple reason that elemental shields are very, very hard to break unless you use an opposing element. Another perfect example of this, Hydro Shield makes someone completely immune to Nuvolette. So the Hydro Abyss Mage is immune to Nuvolette, whereas Alhaitham cuts through that shield like butter, specifically because of how good Dendro is against Hydro. And these sorts of reactions are all over the place, meaning there is no single character who can beat every last enemy in the game efficiently. Mind you, it is technically possible to work around even the restrictions of Catalyst users like Neuvillette. However, you're jumping through a lot of hoops to try to put a square peg in a round hole situation. So, this is the first important consideration. Elemental matchups mean that no matter how good Neuvillette is, he will not replace Moika. Similarly, Moika will never replace Neuvillette, nor will Clarande replace Moika or Alhaitham or any of the other DPSs here. So, that is the first thing. Elemental matchups mean that individual elements will never really power creep each other. Now we get into a different scenario. What about within a given element? Do you see power creep within, say, Pyro and Electro, between Pyro units and Electro units, within their own elemental branches, so to speak? And the answer here is where the yes from my initial statement comes from. Diluc is de facto a worse DPS than Moika. Diluc is both of these are 5-star units, obviously, but Diluc came out when the game was new. He was in 1.0, and he became a standard banner 5-star. And that's a rather important distinction to make. Limited characters tend to be better than permanent ones. Permanent, another word for standard, just to be clear. So, Moika is a limited 5-star Pyro, whereas Diluc is a standard banner permanent 5-star. And generally, this will mean that Diluc will perform worse than Moika. And at the moment, Moika is one of the best Pyro DPSs in the game, rivaled by such characters as Linny, Arlecchino, and Hu Tao. And I say that in no particular order. So, the point I make with these two is that in some instances, yes, there are cases where one character is simply better than another. I would not use Diluc over Moika. Simple as that. But that has a large part to do with Diluc being a permanent or standard banner 5-star. And a bit less to do, well, with the 5-star difference in general. Now, you might have noticed Clarande and Raiden over here. I've seen people argue that Clarande, well, power crept Raiden. And this is another case where I have to push back against this idea. I'd even suggest it's silly. So, Raiden and Clarande both can act as primary DPS units. They are similar to Diluc and Moika in that way. However, Raiden is a lot more flexible than Clarande is. Clarande is almost purely an on-field DPS, to the extent that she can do virtually nothing from off-field. Her kit and her abilities simply do not function unless she is on-field and attacking. Raiden, by contrast, is one of the most potent elemental skills in the game, giving a good amount of electro application and high damage, too, completely off-field. And with 100% uptime on that ability, too. Again, Raiden is exceptionally good for off-field electro application, and with her burst, she's able to take the on-field main DPS role. And when you compare the damage output of Clarond and Raiden, both at C0, mind you, their damage output is similar. The difference is that Raiden only has her attack available during her burst, whereas Clarond can use her elemental skill to enter her damage phase. So, fundamentally, these two units can perform the same role, and, purely as the on-field DPS, Clarond might edge out Raiden, might best her in terms of numbers, and in ease of use. Again, Raiden is reliant on her burst, Clarond is not. However, Raiden is not power crept by Clarond in her secondary role. Clarond simply does not have a secondary role at all. So, no, Raiden is not power crept by Clarond. The only argument you have in favor of that suggestion is the purely on-field side of things, and completely ignoring the fact that Raiden is one of the best off-field units in the game, who is also flexible enough to be the on-field attacker too. And again, this is where the complexity of Genshin's combat system makes it rather hard to simply declare that one character is power crept by another. The best you can say is cases like Diluc versus Moeka, where they play the exact same role, except one of them simply does it far better than the other. And even then, I would not blame anybody for playing Diluc instead of Moeka. After all, style is another factor in this game. If you don't like a character, then it really doesn't matter how good they are. I'm guilty of that myself, frankly. Linny is one of the best pyros in the game, and I just do not like his design. Not a fan of his gameplay. So, again, nothing against anyone who chooses Linny, just not my cup of tea. And again, not throwing shade at anybody for making their choices of who they want to play. In fact, what I'm saying here is go right ahead. Because whilst Moeka is a better pyro DPS than Diluc, it's not to such a hilarious degree that you can't still beat the game with Diluc. Particularly not if you're skilled at it. So, in summation, and going back to our beginning, no single character is going to be able to clear all content in the game. Or at least, not do so easily. You can make a niche case for just about anybody clearing any content, but how many hoops you have to jump through to make that happen? Ew. That's another matter entirely. But the root of it is, no matter how good Neuvillette is, he does not replace Moeka, and Moeka does not replace Neuvillette. She does not power creep him. And the same again is true for each of the other elements. Clarond does not replace Alhaitham, and Alhaitham doesn't replace Moeka, and so on and so forth. The way the elements match up in this game make it too complicated to simply blanketly declare that any single unit invalidates or obsoletes any of the others. And even in cases where they seem to do so, where two units play the same role and have the same element, even then, nuances in the kit, such as the distinction between Clarond and Raiden, can make the difference, all the difference in the world about their uses. An example for that is that on my Clarond Chevreuse Overload team, I actually am in fact using Raiden in the off-field electro role I was mentioning. So again, did Claron power creep Raiden? Not really, no, because they can play different roles. And that is the key. Genshin is a team-building game, where your team composition and how it plays is the most important aspect to actually building a team and beating the game easily. And I think that about wraps this up. Simply put, the game is too complicated to simply declare that anyone was particularly power-crept. There are instances where you could make the argument, but even then, you have such things as the Imaginarium Theater and the, Spiral Abyss to also consider. Though, I would caution anyone who tries to use the Spiral Abyss as an indication of power creep. For the simple reason that, rather than power creep, it is an issue of feature creep. Lately, the Abysses have had a lot of enemies, as of 5.3 when I'm making this. They have a lot of enemies from Natlan that have Night Soul tied mechanics. And that's more a test to see either if you have lots of characters with Night Soul in it, or if you have really, really high elemental application to make up for a lack of Night Soul. Again, they're testing to see whether or not you have certain characters. They are incentivizing you to get characters like Moika, and Seedlolly and Shilonen and so on, to make beating the Abyss easier. And that's an entire subject on its own. And unfortunate as it is that they're doing it that way, well, it's not a sign of power creep. Not on its own. For the simple reason that this will change every month. And the test, at the moment, that might stonewall some characters, well, they'll flip in a month and possibly be a complete cakewalk for the same people who are having a struggle this time. So, yeah, Spiral Abyss is not a good indication of power creep. Rather, it is an indication of feature creep, where they want you to buy into the new thing. So again, not exactly power creeping per se. As for the theater, this changes the name of the game completely. Before the theater, you would only really want to have one fully built DPS and support, or a couple supports for each given element, but with the theater, you kinda want as many fully built units as you can get your hands on. Meaning that having Diluc and Moika both prepared can actually pay dividends in here. So, while Moika is still better than Diluc, Diluc still has use. The theater presents an opportunity for Diluc to show his quality once again. So, yeah, again, he is weaker than Moika, definitely, and it saddens me personally because I really like Diluc. He was my first 5-star ever, and he got me through Dragonspine on my first account. So he's got a special place in my heart for that reason alone. So, I would have loved it if they made him better, and they kinda did with Shen Yun, but not going into that. Point is, even when you have the elemental matchups, with both Moika and Diluc being Pyro, even then, there are scenarios where you'll want D-Luke too. Which, again, kinda goes against the idea of power creep. Because power creep, the negative version of it, basically states that you will never use or want to use an older unit because the newer one is simply better in every way. And, as I've demonstrated, or tried to demonstrate anyway, that's not actually going to be true very often in Genshin. Unless you're talking silly stuff, like comparing 5-star Moika with 4-star... Let's see, where is she? Let's see... Well, you could compare Moika to Amber, but that would be particularly cruel, I feel. Amber is the very first 4-star unit who joins your party. And she does have her uses. Instead of looking there, I think I'll just go straight to my archive, because I know exactly where she is here. Xinyan. Yep, you could directly compare Xinyan to Moika. And there are people who have built her, and made her an absolute powerhouse. But just the comparison to her and Moika. They are both Pyro Claymores, but one's a 5-star, and the other is a 4-star. And if you're doing comparisons like that, you're not exactly being fair, now are you? And on that note, I think I'll end this video. It was a bit of a slightly unstructured rant sort of thing, and it's dragging on a bit long now. So, if you've enjoyed this little rant of mine, or if you disagree with it completely, by all means, tell me so in the comments. I actually do want to hear what you guys think about this. Do you think I'm full of it, and there is awful power creep in Genshin? Or do you agree with me, and suggest that the nuances of the system prevent there from actually being effective power creep? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed it, please leave a like and subscribe. Would help me out a lot, frankly. Have a good day, as always.